Chairman Flake mentioned, you have individual leaders in these countries that manipulate their constitution and brutalize opposition so they can stay in power. The human rights violations are unspeakable in some of these countries. Good governance has been absent. Broad human rights violations and corruption is widespread. We need to invest more in democracy and democratic institutions. And when you take a look at the budget support for Africa for democracy, it is embarrassingly low. We need to make more resources available to build up the institutions of good governance. You know, I've said this a couple times in this committee, I spent a lot of time on the Helsinki Commission in my service in the House of Representatives and now my service in the United States Senate. And in Europe, the lesson that was learned that if you're going to have stable regimes, it's more than just having a military, and it's more than just trying to have wealth in your economy, because a lot of these countries have wealth in their economy, but it doesn't translate to their people. You have to have good governance. And that's been lacking in Central Africa. And the United States can play a much more constructive role in building democratic institutions. And this committee has the oversight of that, and we should be looking at how we can advance good governance in Central Africa and throughout the continent. Number two, the second thing we can do is accountability. The impunity in Central Africa for gross violations of people's rights is well known. You need to have a justice system that holds those that have perpetrated these acts accountable. Otherwise, future generations will just continue the violations of rights. And the United States knows how to deal with this. We know how to build up the institutions of independent judiciaries, how we can bring international attention to it, and we need to do a better job on accountability. And there are some examples in some countries where they're making some progress. Let's support that. Let's put a spotlight on it. Let's use it as a model for other countries, and let's demand as part of the U.S. involvement that we insist upon accountability for those who violated the trust. And the third, Mr. Chairman, is diplomacy, and this is where America excels the best. We have the biggest spotlight in the world that we can put on problems. When America speaks, the world listens to us. And we haven't spoken enough in Africa, and certainly not enough in Central Africa. So we got to put more attention on these issues. And we need to use diplomacy more effectively than we have in the past by engaging the international community more than we have in regards to Central Africa. And that's why I come back to where I started. I'm particularly proud that we're holding this hearing today, Chairman Flake's leadership on this, Chairman Corker's leadership on this. It shows our committee's attention and interest to the details and to this priority. And I thank again all those who were responsible for convening this hearing. It's an extremely important hearing in the Senate Foreign Relations. So that was, Chairman, I would turn it over to Senator Markey, who will sit in for me as I go to the floor to defend our committee's work on North Korea. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Cardin. Senator Markey, do you want to make a statement?
I'm fine at this time.
All right, we'll go ahead and get started. First witness on the first panel here is the Honorable Linda Thomas Greenfield, Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of African Affairs. You're not a stranger to this committee, testifying many times, and I always appreciate the briefings that I get from you and my office receives from your office. Second witness is the Honorable Thomas Perriello, the Special Envoy to the Great Lakes region and the Democratic Republic of the Congo at the State Department. I know you're incredibly busy. We appreciate you both being here. You know the drill. Your records will be put as part of or your testimony as part of the record. But if you could summarize in about 5 minutes, that would be great, and then we'll go with questions after that. Ambassador Thomas Greenfield.
Thank you, Chairman Flake, Ranking Member Cardin, and other members of the committee for the opportunity to testify today on the many challenges and opportunities facing countries in the Central African region. I'm pleased to be here with my friend and colleague, Tom Perriello, the Secretary Special Envoy for the Great Lakes region. Tom just returned from his most recent trip in the region and will provide more details on key aspects of our policy approach in the region and his own ceaseless efforts in that area. Also, we were both in Addis Ababa at the African Union last week, where we engaged with partners on key issues in the region. Though it's extremely challenging, the administration continues to prioritize efforts to strengthen democratic institutions, spur economic growth, and advance peace and security, and promote opportunity and development in Burundi, Democratic Republic of Congo, Rwanda, Central African Republic, and the Republic of Congo. We are deeply concerned with the ongoing political crisis in Burundi. During the AU summit, we were disappointed that the AU's Peace and Security Council determined that it was premature to deploy the African Prevention and Protection Mission in Burundi to Burundi. The entire AU Assembly of Heads of State later decided, and we were very happy with that decision, to send a delegation of 5 African heads of state to Bujumbura to urgently press President Nkurunziza for an inclusive dialogue. The delegation's mandate will include consultations with the government of Burundi on the deployment of the African Union Prevention and Protection Mission. In December, we decided 2 pro-government and 2 opposition individuals to our Burundi. We decided to add 2 opposition and 2 government individuals to our Burundi sanctions list, bringing the total number of 8 individuals who have been sanctioned for engaging in actions that threaten the peace, security, and stability of the country, and we're prepared to add more as appropriate. In January, AGOA trade benefits were withdrawn from Burundi due to continued violence, and we continue to support critical health services to protect the most vulnerable populations and provide assistance to promote reconciliation and dialogue among the youth. Before turning to our concerns about the current political and security situation in the Democratic Republic of Congo, I want to update you on the adoption crisis that is affecting many of your constituents. We have seen some movement. The DRC Council of Ministers recently approved and submitted the long-awaited draft adoption legislation to their parliament and committed to reconstitute in the Interministerial Commission to review the remaining cases. Now, I have to say we've been down this road before, and we will not be satisfied until these commitments are fulfilled. And at every opportunity, we raise this with our colleagues in the Democratic Government of Congo. And I want to assure you and your constituents who anxiously await to bring their children home that this issue remains a priority for the department at the highest levels. We're deeply concerned by the growing political crisis in DRC. President Kabila's final term in office ends in December per that country's constitution. Efforts by President Kabila's parliamentary alliance to amend the constitution or guarantee electoral delay have been vigorously resisted by the opposition as well as by permanent civil society organizations. Special Envoy Perriello will go into more detail on our analysis and on our approach to the situation, but it's our assessment that a choice by President Kabila to honor the Congolese constitution and the wishes of the Congolese people to hold free, fair, transparent, and inclusive elections with President Kabila gracefully transitioning power has the greatest hope for building on the legacy of economic and social progress that he's made during his tenure in office. In Rwanda, we're deeply disappointed that President Kagame missed an opportunity to set a historic example and provide leadership to set his own country on a firm foundation of strong democratic institutions that can sustain the economic development of that country. It will be critical for Rwanda's government to allow even to encourage the free and unfettered expression of dissent and peaceful opposition, particularly in the run-up to local elections in 2016, presidential elections in 2017, and parliamentary elections in 2018. We're also concerned in Rwanda of credible reports that recruitment of Burundian refugees may have occurred in the past year in the camps in Rwanda. It is essential that Rwanda play a constructive role in addressing regional conflicts, and we welcome their public and their private commitment to support a political and not military solution to the crisis in Burundi. We will continue to closely monitor developments in that area. In the Central African Republic, December 30th, first round of presidential elections were peaceful with a reported 79% voter turnout. Relations are generally cordial, but have been tested in recent months over the issue of presidential term limits and repression of legitimate political opposition. While President Nguesso has not formally declared his candidacy, it is expected that he will run in the scheduled March 20 elections. We are disturbed by the arbitrary arrest of dozens of opposition supporters since October and opposition leaders who have been subject to harassment and disappointment. Just yesterday, we were shocked and even appalled by the brutal attack on retired General Mokoko, who recently declared his candidacy for president, and his supporters were subject to those attacks as well. I know that this is not the face that the Congolese people want to project to the world. We will continue to urge the government to respect the provisions of its new constitution that guarantees the freedoms of expression and peaceful assembly, and hold those accountable for the attacks that occurred yesterday. We are monitoring the run-up to the February 18th Uganda national elections. Report of the police using excessive force, obstruction and dispersal of some opposition rallies, harassment of journalists contribute to a climate of fear and intimidation. It is important to underscore the need for all candidates and their campaigns to refrain from inflammatory rhetoric that could incite violence. Chairman Flake, Ranking Member Cardin, and members of the committee, let me thank you again for giving me the opportunity to discuss our extensive engagement in the region. We will continue our proactive diplomatic efforts and coordinate with members of the international community to help address the issues facing the Central African region. I hope this information that I provided to the committee is helpful. I have submitted a longer version of my testimony in writing for the record, and I will look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Ambassador Perriello.
Thank you so much, Chairman, Ranking Member, other members. I didn't know that. Thank you, Chairman, Ranking Member, members of the committee, for the opportunity to testify today and for drawing more attention to this important set of issues. I also want to thank your tremendously talented staffs for their work and attention to these issues on a regular basis. For the people of the Great Lakes, 2016 is a historic year. And for the United States, this year tests 2 decades of bipartisan investment in stability, democracy, atrocity prevention, and shared prosperity in the region. Unfortunately, we are tracking several disconcerting regional trends of closing political space, escalating conflict, and leaders determined to stay in power beyond constitutional term limits. Yet we also see the peoples of the region as committed as ever to peace, rule of law, and building a future very different from their past. The central challenge for Rwanda, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Burundi over the next year is whether their leaders will strengthen or undermine their own democratic trajectories. The stakes are high because, as we've seen in Burundi, when leaders take steps that reverse democratic progress, it can risk instability and strife. In each of these countries, citizens have consistently called for democratic systems of government and put in place constitutions to ensure regular transitions of power through free, fair, and credible elections. Polling across Africa shows overwhelming support for term limits and for democratic transitions over the calcifying leadership of a few strong men. As one young person from the region said to me recently, "Youth like me are not putting our faith in our next leader, we're putting our faith in the promise that there will be a next leader." A much better future is within reach, but like so many of the youth across the Great Lakes region, we also see cause for concern. The deteriorating crisis in Burundi serves as a cautionary tale of the consequences of a leader clinging to power at the expense of his country's foundations for stability and social cohesion, and when opposition resorts to violence as a response. Since President Nkurunziza's controversial decision in April 2015 to run for a third term, Burundi has descended into violence and extreme fragility. By way of example, at least 87 people, but likely several hundred, were reportedly killed on December 11th and 12th by government forces in response to an opposition attack on military installations. The sustained crisis has caused more than 240,000 Burundians to flee the country. Pervasive poverty, chronic food insecurity, and reports of rising ethnic tension are exacerbating fear and fueling a looming humanitarian crisis. The UN and other credible international sources have reported serious human rights violations by Burundian security forces, including reports of mass graves, rape, and torture. We continue to believe that the best route out of this crisis is a regionally mediated dialogue amongst all Burundian stakeholders. Ugandan President Museveni convened the first meeting of this dialogue in Entebbe, which I attended on December 28th. While this was an important step that provided some deterrent pressure on both sides, the subsequent delays in organizing a second round may be exacerbating the conflict. I spent most of January in the region urging leaders to secure a date for the next round of talks and a promise from both sides to rejoin the dialogue in good faith. In my recent meetings with President Nkurunziza and other senior Burundian officials, I emphasized that the government's refusal to allow independent monitors and media into the country to investigate horrific allegations against them can only deepen suspicions that the government has something to hide. The deployment of the full contingent of independent African Union observers and civilian protection units would signal a strong commitment to protecting the people of Burundi and resolving this crisis. I also noted that the AU monitors could have a deterrent effect, leading to reduced violence and establishment of shared facts. The State Department is working to ensure that we're doing everything we can to address the humanitarian crisis. We're coordinating closely with regional bodies and the European Union to maximize pressure on those committing violence and atrocities, including through sanctions and cuts to assistance. Our priorities remain pressuring all sides to refrain from further violence, to commit to a regionally mediated dialogue, and to support AU and UN contingency planning. For a decade, Burundi stood as a success story of post-conflict reconciliation, with the signing and implementation of the Arusha Agreement. We continue to believe that the preservation of the principles of Arusha is fundamental to restoring stability and prosperity to the country. While the threat of civil war is imminent, time yet remains for leaders to recommit to the foundations of peace and social cohesion that could once again provide a basis for stability and progress. If Burundi is the cautionary tale, the DRC is the country that retains the best chance to apply these lessons to ensure the first peaceful, democratic transfer of power in that country's history. A political crisis is building as the DRC prepares, or rather fails to prepare, for upcoming historic elections, scheduled for this November. This next year will determine whether the DRC builds on the significant gains of the previous decade and its role as the most democratically open country in the region, or reverses course and falls back into instability. If the DRC chooses the path taken by Burundi, the scale of human suffering could dwarf what we've seen next door. A confrontation between President Kabila and those demanding timely and credible elections in the country is not inevitable, but it is becoming increasingly probable with each day that the constitutional deadline for election nears. The Kabila administration's efforts to close citizen space and postpone the start of electoral preparations raise concerns about intentions to hold power beyond the constitutional term. Fortunately, the DRC government has not yet crossed any points of no return, and timely and credible elections consistent with the country's constitution are still possible. The primary barriers to holding elections by the end of 2016 are political, not technical. While logistical and technical challenges are very real and sizable, especially the need to update the voter registry, they are ultimately solvable if and when the government and others are committed to timely and credible elections. However, uncertainty is rarely the ally of stability, and the current strategy of delays risks just that kind of instability. Adding to our concerns is the systematic escalation of repression and shrinking political space as documented by the United Nations. The government has repeatedly detained opposition members and youth activists, publicly equating the opposition with enemies of the state, shutting down media outlets, and breaking up peaceful protests. While we support efforts by the AU to negotiate a peaceful constitutional path forward with the DRC government and opposition groups, we are also working to ensure that any protests are peaceful and that any peaceful protests are not met with the repressive force that destabilized Burundi a year ago. Kabila has an opportunity once again to cement his legacy in the DRC and the region, becoming not just the leader who brought his nation peace, but also the father of its constitutional democracy and a model for his peers. We continue to stress to regional and global stakeholders the distance between the massive step forward or backward that's at stake with this electoral cycle and the DRC's first peaceful democratic transition of power. Lastly, I want to discuss our multifaceted relationship with Rwanda, which takes into account Rwanda's tremendous advances in development and contributions to peacekeeping operations around the world. However, as we work with Rwanda on furthering these gains, our relationship increasingly takes into consideration our growing and long-standing concerns regarding Rwanda's democratic trajectory and human rights record. The Rwandan government's efforts to systematically silence opposition and critical voices inside the country threatens the political pluralism and citizen space that are vital to strong democratic institutions, an entrepreneurial economy, and long-term stability. Most recently, we saw these trends converge during a rushed referendum process that passed constitutional amendments that would allow President Kagame to serve as many as 17 more years in office. Human rights advocates and other individuals perceived to pose a threat to the government in Rwanda and abroad. Additionally, we are concerned by reports of Rwanda engaging in destabilizing behavior outside of its border. There are credible reports of recruitment of Burundian refugees, including children, at camps in Rwanda to fight for the Burundian opposition. Recently, I met personally with 3 Burundian teenagers who claimed to have been recruited from a Rwandan refugee camp, trained as rebel fighters, and led into the DRC with fake ID cards. We've condemned these actions and called on the Rwandan government to investigate the reports and hold accountable those responsible for unlawful conduct. Finally, we continue to raise our concerns directly with the Rwandan government and look for opportunities to promote fundamental freedoms in Rwanda. We urge the government of Rwanda to enable the full and unfettered exercise of human rights, including freedoms of peaceful assembly, association, and expression, as Rwanda moves towards local elections this year, presidential elections in 2017, and parliamentary elections in 2018. While many trends in the region cause concern, including the closing of political space and the weakening of constitutions, we continue to see peoples in each country that want to be defined by the promise of the region's future and not the personalities and ethnic tensions of its past. They share President Obama's belief that Africa's future will be built not on strong men, but strong institutions.
Ambassador Thomas Greenfield, with regard to Rwanda, what role are they playing in the deteriorating situation in Burundi? You mentioned that some refugees have gone into Rwanda and being trained. Some of them are going to the DRC. Are some going back into Burundi? Is that the concern?
Yes, sir. We have seen a number of reports from our colleagues in the field that suggest the Rwandan government has been involved in destabilizing activities in Burundi. We have raised these concerns with the Rwandan government. We've encouraged them to play a productive role and not to do anything that might further destabilize Burundi. They've heard our messages. We continue to hear the reports, and we continue to raise these. We were somewhat pleased recently that they themselves have announced that they want to see a constructive dialogue moving forward, and they participated in the recent meetings that were held in Uganda.
Thank you, Ambassador Perriello. You say that the point of no return in DRC has not been reached in terms of the elections coming up, and that the problems are more political than technical or logistic. When will we hit that point of no return? How much longer do we have when we realize that these elections simply can't be held as scheduled?
Well, hopefully we'll never hit a point of no return, but I think there is growing concern that it could be approaching both in terms of a chronological deadline and also tactical uses by the government. Obviously, we've seen in Burundi and elsewhere that the more a government escalates repressive tactics and closing of political space, the more that can calcify the opposition and put destabilizing processes in motion. So in terms of tactically, we've seen just in the last few weeks a tremendously aggressive response that included police moving into church property on the anniversary of celebrating martyrs from a previous protest, mainly Catholic churches across Kinshasa. We've seen responses to soccer fans who were chanting anti-Kabila slogans. So these are the sorts of things, unfortunately, that we saw escalate in Burundi and take things off the rails. So I think there's a tactical component. We've tried to communicate very clearly to the government that there will be consequences from the U.S. government, as allowed under Executive Order 13671, for sanctions or other tools if that path is taken. In terms of the chronology, the opposition has at least claimed that they feel that it's still within the timeline available. There are those in the government and some technical experts who believe that line has already been crossed. What I think we're seeing is that the next couple of months are probably the period, one way or another, in which this political showdown will come to a head. And it's our position that regardless of what form that takes, whether it's a international dialogue or a national dialogue or some other means. The important thing is that Congolese voices are respected, including those voices that are dissent from the government. So I think we'll be looking both at tactical points of no return as well as the chronological questions that are coming up.
Thank you. Ambassador Thomas Greenfield, what leverage do we have in these countries that we haven't used already? We've canceled MCC compacts, we've moved ahead on other things. What else is in our quiver other than working with our friends and allies in the region?
I think we've used all the levers that are at our disposal, and we will continue to use those. I think sanctions are still out there, additional sanctions. We've applied some in the case of Burundi, and we do have the opportunity, if things do not improve, to apply those sanctions in DRC as well. But I think also a key component is to get the neighbors, the countries in the region, our colleagues in the EU and in the AU to join forces with us. It's not something that we alone can accomplish. We need the voices and the weight and the leverage that these other entities bring to the table. And that was part of our effort when we were at the AU in Addis, meeting with EU colleagues and with the AU Commission and others to push them also to join us in pressuring these governments to do the right thing.
Thank you. Now, Senator Markey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much. Last week I sent a letter to Secretary Kerry expressing deep concern about the situation in the DRC and in particular President Kabila's apparent attempts to delay elections and stay in power beyond the time allowed under the DRC's constitution. As I wrote my letter, President Kabila has played an important role in the DRC's path from war to relative stability, but that very progress is now threatened by his apparent intent to defy his country's constitutional foundation. This apparent attempt to subvert the Constitution appears to be part of a growing trend in which President Kabila's government feels free to defy the DRC's laws. We have seen it in the closing of political space, violent repression, closure of media outlets. We also see it in the government's general suspension of exit visas for children adopted by American families through the DRC's court system. In my letter, I stressed the need to build on your efforts to persuade President Kabila to move forward with the DRC's presidential election as required under the Constitution. I believe it is critical that we clearly and unequivocally communicate the following 3 points to President Kabila. Number one, he should immediately, clearly, and publicly state that he will not remain in power once his term ends this year. 2, provided there is verified on-the-ground progress towards a free and fair national election this year, including an end to the current efforts to close political space and crack down on peaceful dissent, the U.S. and international partners will help fund the electoral process. And 3, if he fails to meet clear benchmarks required to hold a free and fair election this year, then the United States and other partners will implement targeted sanctions on President Kabila and his inner circle. Could you comment on what actions the administration is anticipating in the event that President Kabila does not allow for free and fair elections?
Thank you, Senator Markey, and the letter was certainly received, and we appreciate, again, the attention being paid to the Great Lakes. We think this is a time, and I hear this from the Congolese people all the time, where they appreciate the sense that the eyes of the world are on this moment in the country. I think there is a lot of pride, while we certainly talk about our own policy under President Obama of emphasizing constitutions and term limits. The reality is that this is the Congolese people's constitution. It's their decision overwhelmingly to support term limits. It's their position that they've supported their own constitution and open political space and pluralism. And I think they see this with a great deal of pride as having been something that was forged out of an incredibly brutal and difficult period of multiple wars and suffering. And I think the desire right now is not to be for or against any individual, but to be for a better future and better constitution. And I think there's strong appreciation that the United States government has been there to support the Congolese people and that hard-fought constitutional space. As Assistant Secretary Thomas Greenfield noted, we have pursued a variety of both positive and negative incentives in looking at the situation in DRC and communicated clearly and in advance that there will be consequences if certain actions are taken that undermine democracy or undermine security. We've seen the U.S. government's willingness to do that in Burundi in sanctioning both members of the government for acts of repression as well as members of the opposition. In the case of DRC, we already have an executive order, as I mentioned, 13671, that gives us the ability to consider those actions. The hope is still that this is going to be a historic opportunity where the government and opposition and others come together and figure out a path forward. But the stakes are so high in terms of potential human suffering, but also the inevitable regional components of dynamics in the DRC that we want to do as much before this becomes a crisis as we can. So we want
my concern is that it's obvious what Kabila is doing and where he's going, and that he understands how hard the United States is going to come down on him and his cronies, on him personally, on his cronies personally, so that he is made a symbol of international reproach, and that we have a plan in place that he clearly understands that will be imposed upon him, and that we will not stand on the sidelines on this issue. In March of 2015, more than 400 bodies were found buried in a rural part of the country. Human Rights Watch has suggested that some of the bodies were those of individuals who had died in anti-government protest over a proposal to delay the 2016 presidential elections. The two television channels that were shut down were owned by a former governor of the province in Katanga, who was known to be a strong political opponent of the government. And so there's a clear progression with regard to what is taking place in this country. There's a long, unfortunate history in this country. So is the United States committed to taking strong action in the event that Kabila does, in fact, continue down the pathway that he is progressing?
May I? Absolutely, Senator, we are. We have used every diplomatic level at the highest level to impress upon President Kabila the importance of him stepping aside. It is not. It is unusual that he would get a call from the president. He has gotten visits from the secretary. We are encouraging him to make the right decision, and it is our hope that he will make the right decision. The consequences of him making the wrong decision, the horrible consequences of him making the wrong decision, is the impact that this will have on a country that is imploding around him. Having that situation happen in DRC is much bigger than what we've seen happening in Burundi. So that's the biggest consequence. But in terms of using the tools that we have to apply sanctions on him, there's no hesitation to do that. I think the important thing is that we have to get others in the region to support us in that effort. And that is something that we're working on as well. President Kabila has a legacy already. He kept this country relatively peaceful over the past few years. That legacy is going to be lost. His reputation will be lost if he does not gracefully leave power and have his country continue to proceed down the road of democracy.
Thank you. Senator Perdue.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank both of you for your tireless effort.
So I think it's an incredibly important question, and I want to echo what the ranking member said before he had to go about the importance of investments in governance, particularly in this area. And I think it's something where we have many partners on the ground in civil society and in many cases within governments themselves who actually want to do the difficult work of governing well. I want to make one comment about the adoptions thing before moving on, which is just to reiterate how dedicated Assistant Secretary Thomas Greenfield and others have been. While many of us, it's not our primary job to work on this issue, they have made clear that this is an all-team effort, and so all of us have been asked to pitch in on this, which we are glad to do given the stakes for these children. And I just want to commend the families as well, most of whom have gone out of their way to be incredibly patient and very engaged with all of us. And I think it's been just an unbelievable human experience to witness that and what they've gone through. On the governance issue, I think we have the President Obama set a very clear line in the sand in his ADA speech about the importance of constitutions and of term limits. I think it's widely known that it was the largest applause line of that speech, and polling across Africa has reinforced the idea that this is a widely popular notion among the African people, even though it may not have the same level of popularity among the African leaders themselves. This is particularly popular and important as a policy with the African youth, which represent in many cases 50% or more of populations around the continent. This is not a situation where we can simply declare it so, but I think we can be the strongest force possible for making the case of why constitutions matter. I think in a situation like Rwanda, you've seen them get many indicators up to speed that should suggest foreign direct investment would follow, but you haven't actually seen FDI follow in that country. And one of the issues raised by the private sector repeatedly is concerns about closed political space and the instability that inevitably comes with that set of policies. We believe Burundi, in many ways, is a tragedy, but it is also something that has proven the point of the policy to begin with, which is that constitutions matter. Constitutions matter, and people worked hard for this. And I think that's, again, one of the things that's been most inspiring for me in this job is the fact that we are reinforcing the voices of people around the region who really do want to put these periods of bad governance, of ethnic conflict and other conflict behind them. So investments in governance are well spent. I think where we can use both positive and negative incentives to try to encourage governments to do the difficult work to move in the right direction we can. And again, while we're very concerned about the trends, we don't believe that this is a lost cause. The people of Burundi spent a decade looking at post-conflict reconstruction, including along ethnic lines. The military, the investment in the military, for example, showed a degree of professionalism and inter-ethnic cooperation that has probably been one of the factors that has kept Burundi from getting far worse. We've seen the same thing in faith communities and civil society groups. So while it's hard to prove a negative, the fact is I think those investments of the last decade are probably one of the things that has kept things from moving back to a situation in the 90s. So we want to build on that success.
Don't know that figure, but we will get back to you
Okay,
with
thank
an
you.
answer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. Senator Coons.
Well, thank you, Chairman Flake, Ranking Member Markey. Thank you, Madam Assistant Secretary and Ambassador Perriello, Special Envoy Perriello. Appreciate your testimony today. Let me just briefly lay out 3 or 4 questions, and then if you'd take the remainder of the time to answer them as you will. I'm interested in following up on 2 countries that both of you referenced, but that haven't been the focus of our discussion so much so far. Uganda in particular, what role has their upcoming elections and some of the oppression or closing space for civil society in Uganda, what role has that played in the AAC's efforts to negotiate a political agreement in Burundi? Talk about the Central African Republic. There are so many other...
For Kabila or against Kabila, but they're definitely for their constitution and they're definitely for elections and stability.
Great, thank you.
Senator Isaacson.
Is he going the other way?
I too agree with your early assessment of President Kagame. He has a huge legacy that will be tarnished and diminished if he stays in power. He's changed the Constitution, so it's not beyond the constitutional limit, but if he stays in power for a 3rd term, having changed the Constitution. So that legacy, I think, is important. There are people who believe that he is a destabilizing force in the region. We have seen the reports of his involvement or his country's involvement within Burundi, and particularly as it relates to recruiting and training of refugees inside the borders of Rwanda. The M23 situation clearly was an example of activities outside the region. Again, we're continuing to press him to honor his own legacy and keep Rwanda on the positive track that we all hope Rwanda remains on in the future.
The only other comment would be in my travels in Africa, I've met a lot of the leaders. The late Jonathan Mills in Ghana was a great president. He term limited himself and that country.
President Kabila has this national dialogue that's going that I guess has been supported by the African Union. I don't know that the United States has expressed a position about it or not, but I know opposition within the country feel like, what do we need a national dialogue for? The Constitution is really clear about what the electoral processes should be. Educate me a little bit about the role of the African Union. I mean, is the support for the, is it that clear in DRC that, yeah, the electoral processes are clear and the national dialogue is just kind of a delaying tactic? And if so, why would the African Union support it? I just am not fluent enough about that regional organization.
Thank you, and thanks for the kind words. I've likened the national dialogue debate so far to trying to broker a house sale between someone who doesn't want to sell their house and someone who doesn't want to buy a house. And I think to the extent that there is not actually a common goal to get to timely, credible elections, then this is really mainly about political power. I think what the African Union has been trying to figure out, and we think it's very constructive, is whether there's actually space to present a credible dialogue to try to broker some of these conversations. As you noted, while there has been a history of dialogue in the country, playing a role at historic moments, that has generally been to end 40 years of dictatorship or to end a civil war. And part of the goal of constitutions, as you know as a constitutional scholar, is to move beyond those debates and have the stability of knowing certain questions have been settled. There are certainly very real technical questions about voter registry, etc. But again, where the political will is there to solve those problems, we've seen DRC solve them before. So we, throughout this job, actually, I just want to say one of the things that's exceeded expectations has been the cooperation with both the European Union and the African Union on a number of issues, both in Burundi and DRC. So former Prime Minister Kojo has been asked to look at this. He's not yet presented, I think, his final recommendations to the African Union Secretariat, but in meetings with him directly and conversations indirectly, I think that there's a clear-eyed sense of understanding what the challenges are, and I think there's a goal on all sides that if we can figure out a way through this political impasse with the least risk to instability, that's a good thing. But ultimately, if one side is unwilling and uninterested to actually negotiate in good faith about how to meet that constitutional deadline, then that's going to be a very difficult situation. So our sense is it can only be helpful for them to be looking at the problem, and we will look forward to seeing what recommendations they make.
I wanted to ask a question about just to underline an exclamation point, the importance of the adoption issue, which I know you've testified.
Thomas Greenfield, thank you for your service. I want to get your assessment in regards to the resources that we are putting in to help develop democratic institutions in Central Africa. If my numbers are right, in the democracy and governance funds, it's about $30 million. That amounts to about 25 cents per person. Is that enough? I know there's more than money involved here, don't get me wrong, but clearly our development assistance is a critical part of our overall strategy, as we all know. And it just, knowing the extent of the challenge in that region, are we doing enough?
Sir, thank you for that question, and your comments early on were music to my ears. I have said since I started this job that we have to put our money where our mouth is. If our highest priority is democracy and governance and good elections and free and fair and transparent elections, those things cost money. And if you look at our budget, when you look at the sliver of the pie that goes toward democracy and governance, it doesn't suggest that this is the highest priority for us. So we are constantly robbing from other resources when we can to support these efforts. We know when we support civil society, when we support electoral commission capacity building, we have good elections. Nigeria was one of those examples. We did put money into that over a number of years into that electoral commission and into building the capacity of civil society, including training election observers. We're not going to send 3,000 election observers to Nigeria. Those election observers were Nigerians who were trained through resources that we and others provided. So it's really important that we find the funding to support these efforts. And if we don't find the funding, we see the consequences of that. I mentioned when you were not in the room that Central African Republic elections were delayed, and they were delayed for legitimate reasons. That government didn't have the money or the capacity to carry out these elections. And we were pressed to find additional sources of funding to support them. And in many cases, people come to us to say, we need you to send election observers. Your election observers really make a difference. Little countries like Comoros, when I was there recently, begged us to send election observers. They actually have pretty good elections. Their president is stepping aside, but he wanted to have election observers, and we were able to find a few pennies to support sending a team of election observers there. So this is really a key priority for us, and I very much appreciate your support and your encouragement in that area.
Thank you. I'm going to mention my other area I mentioned earlier. I find that there's certainly great intentions in the State Department on dealing with atrocities and first and foremost trying to prevent atrocities, and then recognizing that by holding people accountable, it's an indication to the future circumstances that if you act with impunity, you're not going to be treated, you're going to be held accountable for your actions. But then, as you start to get into political solutions, the accountability sections, areas seem to be put on the side. They seem to be a little bit too difficult or too personal, and when you're trying to get people to lay down their arms or to come to the negotiating table, the first thing they want is immunity from all their previous activities. And that cannot be permitted. So I want to know what you're doing and what we need to do to make sure that the accountability aspects are always in active consideration as we look.
Degree of concern by SADC and those individual governments in the situation in the Congo, all of which provides a basis for coming to some common actions. And I certainly think there are shared values and views by those countries that are practicing democracy and have moved much further down the road in terms of good governance than is the case in most of Central Africa.
It was mentioned, I apologize, I forget who mentioned it, that we might have to have some change in rules of engagement or the rules that these regional security forces are operating under. That general UN peacekeeping role may not be robust enough to deal with, I think somebody said, active conflict. Can you comment on that?
I'd be happy to. And my time as heading the UN mission in the Congo was a considerable education process for me in several respects. But I also came to the conclusion that contemporary peacekeeping continues to operate within a paradigm of post-conflict assumptions. And in fact, the situation in Eastern Congo, as well as Mali, South Sudan, and others, are not post-conflict. These are active conflicts. Mm-hmm. And so then the peacekeeping force becomes obliged to try to adapt these post-conflict structures, authorities, managing or dealing with active conflict resolution or management or some form, and it doesn't work very well. The intervention brigade as a MONUSCO, I think, evolved out of regional concerns primarily initially, precisely arising out of that. And given that intervention brigade was given the authority on an extraordinary basis for, quote, targeted offensive operations, to use the language of the appropriate Security Council resolution, This is not to say that there are military solutions available to Eastern Congo or the other situations, but I do think that there is a need to have a capability for enforcement, to deal with those actors or players or entities that are not interested in political solutions or actively trying to block them, to help create the space that is needed to get to political solutions. And I think we are seeing examples of an attempt to adapt to that, for example, in Mali with the French forces there and others. But I don't think we yet have a good alignment between the basic assumptions of contemporary peacekeeping and too often the situations that those peacekeeping missions where they are deployed. And I guess as a final note, I fully support the efforts that was discussed earlier in terms of an African Union force to Burundi. But I think it's very important to have clarity as well as to what the rules will be.
President Museveni has his own vested interests in some of these regional issues, and if the U.S. were to push a bit harder and engage on both carrots and sticks vis-a-vis the domestic situation, that we might not see a change in his regional role. There has time and time again been support for him and his ruling party to engage regionally, but very little engagement on the domestic environment. I was pleased to see the State Department release a statement expressing concern about the pre-election environment about a month ago. But this is an example where, given the 30-year head start, statements alone are not going to do it.
Well, thank you. Do you have anything else to add before we adjourn the hearing? Looks like my colleagues are on the floor where I need to be soon. But I appreciate the testimony that you've given. Again, it'll all be in the record, and if you could respond to questions that come within the next couple of days, the hearing record will remain open for the answer to questions. But again, you have the committee's thanks for your expertise and for your testimony.
Are undergoing political crises. Some of the tactics used to wrest power are different than in the past, where military coups and other blatant uses of force were employed to take or maintain power. Now, however, many leaders in the region are attempting to cling to power by revising constitutional term limits and holding elections that are so imbalanced and restricted that only an incumbent leader is likely to emerge victorious. The suppression of rights is frequently part of a cadre of tools used to reverse progress on good governance, all the while creating a pretext to remain in power in perpetuity. Sometimes it is security forces employing lethal force in response to peaceful demonstrations. Sometimes it is government officials detaining activists or opposition party members. Sometimes it is obstructing media, curtailing civil society organizations from covering sensitive issues. Often it is all of the above together, along with threats or physical assaults. This is what I'll discuss today with a focus on DRC and Uganda, but I'm also happy to talk about Rwanda, Burundi, Ethiopia, Central African Republic during the Q&A. When Kabila's government attempted to change the electoral law in January 2015 to extend his term in office, there were mass protests in the country that forced him to back down and look for other ways to stay in power. The situation, as discussed, has not yet been resolved. But meanwhile, as the election ambiguity has developed, we have seen the government increasingly resort to violent acts of repression, particularly against those who are opposed to Kabila's efforts. Government officials have clamped down on activists and political opponents, in some cases arbitrarily arresting them, throwing them in jail. Security forces have responded to peaceful demonstrations with excessive force. Government officials have blocked free speech by shutting down media outlets, text messaging services, and the internet in an attempt to stop protest leaders from communicating with each other and to block the opposition movement from building momentum. As was discussed earlier, Congo is at a historic crossroads, and we see no signs of this situation abating, especially as nationwide mobilization is set for early next week. In Uganda, they are set to hold elections, both parliamentary and presidential, next week on February 18th. The current president, Yoweri Museveni, has been in office for 30 years, and he shows no sign of relinquishing power. He's basically set the tone for what we are seeing more widely throughout Central Africa. Over the last decade, Museveni has repeatedly created an uneven campaigning environment by silencing dissenting voices, using public funds unlawfully for his own campaigns, emboldening the police to act in aggressive and partisan manners, and threatening media outlets for airing opposition views. Basic rights are often under siege in Uganda, but increasingly so during campaign periods where the dynamic is exacerbated dramatically. Engagement, but the time has come to scale it up significantly. What is needed is a steadfast and coordinated approach that combines carrots and sticks and sets a very clear timeline for the election process and Kabila to step down. There is still a chance to ensure Congo does not follow Burundi's violent and abusive deterioration, but that time may come short. The U.S. role is pivotal here. U.S. policy towards Uganda has a notable deficit when it comes to support for human rights and the rule of law. Part of this myopic approach has occurred because of the country's role as a key regional player and a misguided belief that criticizing domestic circumstances could negatively result in consequences throughout the region. Little has been said or done in the case of Uganda outside of LGBT-related concerns, which is perhaps the most difficult and intractable situation when it comes to good governance. With the election just a week away, options are minimal. I apply more broadly than the two countries that I've discussed. The first is to make better use of public statements. Public expression of concern is very powerful, and it's often underestimated. There is a key moment for the administration to make statements both before and after something occurs, but also it is a key tool for members here on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Responsive and preventive statements to encourage restraint in a potentially volatile situation are particularly important. Imposing targeted sanctions. Targeted sanctions show the possibility of real individual consequences for oppressive acts. Using existing executive orders or seeing the full global Magnitsky bill pass through the entire Congress and be signed by the president would help develop this process over a longer period of time. Third, support civil society more consistently. There is a presidential initiative. There have been funds across the continent, although they are dwindling and have dwindled over time. Finally, be cautious on security assistance. It's no secret that governance priorities often take a back seat to regional security initiatives, which are generally focused on short-term operational needs. Security and stability will not come from supporting security forces alone, but from helping to create the space, political and otherwise, for the next generation of political leaders and civil society activists to develop. Thank you, and I'm happy to take your questions.
Thank you both for your testimony. Ambassador Meese, you sound pretty skeptical about the DRC, their ability to have elections as scheduled. I asked the last panel when the point of no return comes, when we hit the point where they simply can't do it. When do you think that is? Or have we passed it?
Senator, thank you for the question. You are correct. I was ambassador in the DRC for the 2006 elections, and I was there with the UN during the 2011 process that, of course, produced very flawed elections, but were held. It gave me a good sense, however, of the difficulty and the scale of organizing elections in the Congo. And it is my feeling that indeed at this point already, given the lack of timely actions and other problems, including the apparent deliberate efforts to cause a slippage to the calendar, that it would be difficult, if not impossible, to get to legitimate elections this year. Having said that, I would be reluctant to say that there is a point of no return, because the damage that will be created by a delay in the constitutional elections can be mitigated if there was a clear and visible change of course, producing concrete and visible action moving toward legitimate elections. In other words, it is more important, in my view, that there be a process resulting in credible, legitimate democratic elections on a timely basis, even if it slips beyond the formal calendar. But at this point, I don't see any sign of that happening. So a point of no return in terms of being able to organize elections as they should be, as a legitimate exercise this year, I fear has already passed. A point of no return in terms of being able to salvage the situation and move things back into a positive track, I think can certainly still be done.
Can you shed some light, Ambassador, on Rwanda's interest, Kagami's interest in both the DRC and Burundi? What is their preferred outcome They seem to be meddling in both. Can you shed some light there?
I can only speculate what their preferred outcome might be.
Understood.
Rwanda has clear interests in the Eastern Congo, dating all the way back to the '94 genocide. Given the presence of the large number of people who were a part of the genocide who ended up in the Congo, the existence of what is now called the FDLR, remnants of the old militia and military security apparatus in Rwanda, and the FDLR is still there. Excuse me. It has resulted, however, in Rwanda often taking actions to directly meddle in Eastern Congo, including the support of military groups that led to further destabilization and, in my view, contrary to their own interests. There has long been a question in my mind, as well as others, did they wish to exert de facto political influence and control over Kivus or parts of Eastern Congo, influence Kinshasa, or were there ambitions beyond that? And I don't know the answer to that. Fortunately, in my view, thanks to actions taken by the United States and other members of the international community in exerting strong pressure on Rwanda, as well as things coming out of the United Nations, I think their ability to actively meddle in terms of supporting militia groups in Eastern Congo has been severely curtailed. That requires ongoing attention, but at this point at least. The recent reports of potential actions in Burundi, however, suggest that the idea of such cross-border interventions or interference certainly has not left the mindset in Rwanda, and I think requires ongoing attentiveness as well, and if necessary, more international pressure to ensure that these kinds of unhelpful actions do not exist. But they are, in fact, in my view, destabilizing. So a problem not only for the country, DRC, Burundi, or any others, but in fact reflect back on Rwanda as well. And I guess one final comment I would make is that these actions in any of the countries, instability, militia groups, so forth, unrest, clearly has cross-border effects. Anything that occurs in Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi, Eastern Congo affect the other countries inevitably. Now, logically, that should result in a realization that they share common interests to solve these issues and put an end to the unrest, but that has not been the case in the past.
Thank you, Ms. Margon. What is the most acute human rights issue right now in the region? Is it Burundi with the reports there? Where do you see it?
It's a tough question. Thanks for asking it. I mean, we try not to compare one to the other because each one is particular to its own context. I would say the case of Burundi has deteriorated very significantly. We are seeing new signs of killings and disappearances. So in a sense, things seem to be getting a bit more insidious than they have been over the last 10 months. But I would also say that what we see in Uganda, which is not necessarily as outright and overt as one may hope, but has decades of ongoing experience, the restrictions, the police brutality, the absence of accountability is particularly nefarious and very concerning.
In the DRC, should Kabila decide to hold back or move extra constitutionally, impose his will, what potential is there for human rights abuse and then significant conflict?
Thanks. I just want to actually add my point. I don't think it's too late at all for Kabila to step down when it comes to the DRC. Time hasn't run out, and in fact, at the last panel, there was much discussion of the potential of sanctions, which I think sends an important message. The implementation of those sanctions, particularly on individuals in Kabila's inner circle who have been aggressive and encouraged repressive acts, would be very important. And the timing, given the nationwide protests, to watch that very closely is important. The potential for human rights abuses and things to move in the wrong direction in the DRC is very likely. We are nervous about what will happen on February 16th with the mobilization, and we'll be watching closely.
Ambassador Reese, you mentioned that our actions with regard to sanctions or any activity that we try to impose or encourage on governments there is more effective with regional cooperation. How likely is it that we can get the kind of cooperation on some of these issues, whether it's imposition of sanctions from other governments or other things?
Thank you for the question. I believe it is possible to get significant cooperation, and when we speak of the region, I'm speaking of the larger region, which includes SADC, South Africa, other countries in Southern Africa, as well as the African Union and other key governments, but as well key partner governments in Europe and elsewhere as well, to coordinate actions in terms of sanctions, visa restrictions, or other actions. The more that can be brought together into a unified voice and unified actions, there is a disproportionate increase in the effectiveness of such actions. And I think we have seen numerous cases of that in the past. But I think there is a shared concerns, a shared interest by the African Union. The debates and actions taken relative to Burundi is evidence of that. South Africa as a country has played a critical role in Burundi as well as the DRC at different times in the past. The